Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time it is a review of the 2019 horror film Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Now, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is a film that I was genuinely curious about when it was announced because, like a lot of 90s kids, I grew up reading the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark book series. And it's one of those book series that to this day, I am baffled that this was a series of books that was available in local libraries as well as elementary school libraries. Like, I'm talking right there in plain sight in the shelf that has all the other collections of short stories. Here's Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And I'm still stunned that librarians had those books readily available for kids because not only were the stories scary, but the illustrations were pure nightmare fuel. I had plenty of sleepless nights due to those illustrations, and I know I'm not alone. I mean, a lot of 90s kids can definitely share the same sentiment of fear. These books and these illustrations just kept them up at night and left an impact on them. And I get it, Goosebumps was popular and that was in the horror genre, but Goosebumps stories weren't really as scary as some of the stories in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, and they definitely weren't as scary as a whole as the creepy illustrations. So even though I hadn't revisited the stories in years, I was still really looking forward to this film because I thought it was the perfect opportunity for the anthology to make a comeback. I thought Goosebumps was the perfect opportunity for that, to have a anthology film for a new, young, hungry audience of young horror fans, young adult horror fans, which is definitely an audience with all these successful PG-13 horror films. And I thought, a horror anthology would be perfect for that. And Goosebumps went a different route. Goosebumps went the route of let's copy Jumanji and do a shitty job of it. So I was disappointed by that approach and by that film ultimately, as a fan of Goosebumps, the books growing up, and as a fan of the TV show. And so I was hoping that this was going to be the horror anthology that would bring new life into the genre and bring it to a new audience. And when I saw that Guillermo del Toro, was attached to the project, my excitement level for this film went way up. I was like, it's finally happening. We're going to get the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark anthology. It's going to be great. It's going to have the creepy characters that were in the creepy illustrations, and it's going to be a fun ride for kids and adults. And then I heard news that it's not going to it was not going to be an anthology. And sorry, forgive me, I kind of flubbed my lines there a little bit, because it's still to this day is something that was just so disappointing to me. Like, when I found out that it was not an anthology, my heart sank. I was just like, man. And it was just one of those things that's like, as a fan of the anthology genre, it's like, we haven't seen a horror anthology in theaters since what, Tales from the Hood? So it's been like decades since we've had a horror anthology. Trick or Treat never got a theatrical release, even though it was intended to have one. There are other horror anthologies that have come out in the past few years or so that may have gotten limited releases and like film festivals and maybe a handful of theaters, but they didn't get wide releases. And I thought this would be a prime example for that, for a wide release anthology film, because it's for a young adult audience. And that's not the direction they chose to take with it. And then the trailer came out and it copied the same formula that Goosebumps did, and my excitement for the film waned dramatically. And it became a movie that I wanted to see in the theater to a movie that I either didn't care to see or a film that I was going to wait to see when it came out on home video. And that leads us to here, this review. And I didn't really know why it wasn't an anthology until I did a little bit of research recently. And the reason that it's not an anthology, I honestly think, is questionable to say the least. So, Del Toro was asked why this is not an anthology at the Comic-Con in July in 2019. And his answer was, when we started talking about this 5 years ago, I had to think about it. Anthology films are always as bad as the worst story in them. They're never as good as the best story. I remembered in Pan's Labyrinth I created a book called The Book of Crossroads. I thought it could be great if we had a book that reads you and it writes what you're most afraid of. Then the theme became the stories that we tell each other. I don't know what he means by the theme of this movie being the stories we tell each other, because I didn't really get that from this film. I got the book that reads you and reads your fears, which is not really that unique, but at the same time, it was still fine. Because the film did something with it that put a twist on it that made it feel not as old and tired of a hat, so to speak. But his comments about the horror anthology or the anthology format in general, I do not agree with at all. And I'm going to try to be as kind as I can here, because I respect Del Toro a lot. I like a lot of his films. I love his style. I think he's a great visionary. And that being said, I think his opinions on anthologies, I think they are incredibly close-minded. And I'm just wondering how many anthologies he's seen. And I think this is just a way for him to politely say he doesn't like anthologies, and that's why it's not an anthology, which I think is a little close-minded, to say the least. I mean, there's other words I could use here, but I'd rather not go there, because I respect him. I respect him, and this is his opinion, but I definitely disagree with that. I disagree wholeheartedly with the idea that anthology films are always as bad as the worst story in them, and they're never as good as the best story, because Creepshow is a film that I don't even think has a bad segment in it, and the weakest segment doesn't make the film not as strong as it could be, because all the segments are still quite good in terms of quality. Tales from the Dark Side of the Movie has a segment in Lot 249 I'm not really a big fan of, but that doesn't mean the film isn't good because I don't like that segment. I like all the other segments. The Creepshow 2, The Raft is the strongest segment, but I like the other two just fine. I don't like the animated stuff, but that doesn't mean that the film isn't good. Tales from the Hood, I really like that film, but I'm not as big on the last segment as the other segments in the film, but I don't feel that really detracted from the film that much. I mean, when it comes to anthologies that suck, where there's no good segments, or there's just one, then I get that. I get what he's talking about, but I don't think all anthologies are like that. I disagree that they're always as bad as the worst story in them, because I think that's just selling them short. And as well as the idea that they're never as good as the best story. Because to me, the anthology format, especially the horror anthology, if it's done right and it's done well, it's amazing. It's great. You get to see multiple really good short films and different stories in one movie. It's a really great experience, and it's a really good time. It really is the most fun you'll ever have being scared when they do it right. When they do it wrong, it's absolute torture, and it's some of the worst shit you'll ever see, because it's just one shit after another. But yeah, I don't think that's a reason not to have made this an anthology. Maybe, Del Toro could have given his thrown his hat in the ring and made an attempt to, you know, make an anthology that he personally would enjoy or be proud of, and kind of buck that idea that he has of the genre as a whole. It just felt like he just quit. He gave up. He was like, I don't like anthologies. I don't think they're very good, and so I don't want to do it. And instead of bringing audiences, modern audiences, a new anthology, something that people haven't seen in years, he brought us a story and a construct that we've seen numerous times already. So, I mean, that's why I think it really should have been an anthology in the end. And I think it would have been a much stronger film. You could have still had the same characters, but they would have had their own separate stories. And then they would still be strong because you still have these strong, likable characters. But now these stories, they are no longer little throwaways, no longer little morsels. They can be whole meals. And that's kind of what happened here, where you have little morsels of these scary story characters, these monsters interacting with the film's characters, but they leave you wanting more, and they leave you a little bit hungry, and the film leaves you not as satisfied in the end as it could have if it was an anthology, because then these stories would have had more time, these monsters would have had more screen time, and things would have wrapped up more nicely and more cohesively, because in each story would end and really just have its own cohesive narrative. But they decided to go the Goosebumps Jumanji route, which is honestly not surprising, considering that's really honestly what a lot of films do nowadays. They take a formula that was successful, add a few new ingredients, and call it a day. And so I wasn't too surprised in the end that they went that route. But what I was surprised by was how much I actually liked the movie. I mean, I know I'm like 12 minutes into this, and now I'm finally, giving my thoughts on the film itself. But I wanted to give a little bit of a backstory, a little bit of a build-up to my eventual review, because I really thought it was an interesting discussion to talk about Del Toro's opinions on the anthology genre in general. But yeah, I liked the film. I didn't love the movie. I would have loved it if it was an anthology, and it was a well-made, well-done anthology. But I still liked the movie. I thought it was an above-average young adult chiller that had some genuinely scary, tense moments in it, and had some really strong, likable characters, and despite some cliches and some predictable, tired and true moments and aspects of the plot, overall, it was a enjoyable film. I thought the direction by André Øvredal, which I'm sorry, I probably butchered his last name horribly. My apologies, André. I thought it was fantastic. I thought he had a really great eye for visuals, just like Del Toro. And in particular, I thought he worked really efficiently and really well with the cinematographer, Roman Osin. This film has some really great looking sequences for a fairly low budget production. I mean, it's not super low budget, but I mean, it's a $25 to $28 million production. That's not a big budget film in today's Hollywood. So, despite the lower range budget, I felt that it looked amazing on more than one instance. I mean, the sequence in the mental hospital with all the red lighting and everything, like, that was great. I thought it was that was one of many standout scenes in this film in terms of the cinematography. I also felt the production and art design was also quite well done. And it was one of those movies where it had a lot of practical effects. And I think a good reason for that is because of Del Toro's involvement. That's something he really enjoys and he's very passionate about. And there were some moments where, the jangly man was CG, but there was other moments where some shots weren't. Same thing for the twins or the stuff. I think the whole spider. Well, part of the spider pimple, the pimple with the spiders, the red spot. Part of that was practical, but most of it was mostly CGI, and I get why they did that. But if you want to see a scene that's similar to that, but is done practically, watch The Believers. There's a scene in that film where Helen Shaver, she has a red spot of her own, and I'm just gonna say it ain't CGI. There's no CGI spiders coming out of her face. Yeah, it's a really intense sequence that I honestly think is this would have benefited from actually doing the real thing, but I know why they didn't do it. But at the same time, if you've seen the scene in The Believers that I'm talking about, you know how much more powerful that is in terms of like giving you the fear bumps. Giving you those goosebumps. I'm sorry, like I can't even think clearly because I'm just thinking about that scene and it's already freaking me out. So that I apologize for my mixed up dialogue there. But anyway, yeah, for the most part, there's a lot of practical stuff. The scarecrow, and yeah, the ghoul, the lady who wants her big toe, that was done practically, and they were really well done. Really effectively gross and creepy looking practical effects. They're definitely high quality. And when they were on screen, it just goes to show you that you can't really get more real than real, and there's still a place for practical effects, especially in the horror genre. The screenplay by Dan Hagman and Kevin Hagman, I personally feel it did a really good job with the characters, with the cast of the kids, making them likable, giving them enough depth, but not too much that it dominates the screen time and affects the pacing. And even though the stuff with Sarah Bellows and the whole origin story of the scary stories and the book was a little cliched, it was still okay. I do feel that that's the element that is one of the weaker things because it's just like, oh, it's like Jumanji or Goosebumps, but this time it's Sarah Bellows and her stories and da 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 da, and the whole mystery of trying to figure it out wasn't as interesting to me as these kids trying to stay one step ahead of these stories as they come to life, and while they are in the middle of them. I'll give the script a lot of credit for actually maintaining a lot of the darkness and not completely wimping out. Uh, it does leave things open for a sequel and possibility for certain characters to return, but it's not one of those cop-out things where they defeat Sarah Bellows and then she just feels bad and brings everyone back to life and everything's back to normal. So there's no reset button, which I definitely appreciated. And there are some moments in this script that are as intense as anything you would see in an R-rated horror film. In particular, the sequence where Tommy turns into a scarecrow, like that is some really intense, scary, messed up shit. Like that's a really fucked up sequence if you ask me. And it's not gory at all. It's just a really effective bit of body horror where, this poor kid turns into a scarecrow, straw is like popping out of his body and, it's a really hard scene to watch. And there's no gore, there's no blood, there's no anything. So I got to give the writers a lot of credit for um, finding a way to bring genuine terror and scares to a young adult audience without going too far, but still far enough and still towing the edge of the line enough that it doesn't feel tame and it still feels like genuine uh, bits of horror, which is a dynamic that's not easy to really get. And I felt that for the most part they did a good job with that, with all the different scary stories, characters, and monsters that were featured in the film. I just wish they had more screen time, and I wish that and ultimately they didn't, because of the fact that it's not an anthology film. Um, I also really love the setting of the film. I thought the setting and the time and the place of this film. I don't know if I mentioned this earlier or not, but if I did, so what? But I'm going to reiterate it if that's the case. I thought the setting and the time was really inspired. Instead of another film taking place in the 80s, trying to ape Stranger Things, this time around it takes place in in the late 60s. Good song choice in the beginning with Season of the Witch, and just a really nice, refreshing setting and different time and place in the late 60s. Which is a time of turmoil in its own, and and changes and horror with the Vietnam War and everything that came along with that. So there was some adult stuff here too. The stuff with the draft and dodging the draft, and uh, some of the aspects of the film dealing with race, and how the character Ramon is a character who is dealing with racial injustice and a lot of issues and genuine horror and terrors that don't have to do with anything that goes bump in the night. So uh, there are some moments here that are a little bit smarter than you would expect from a young adult horror film. And I would be totally remiss if I didn't mention these actors, who I thought did remarkable jobs. Zoe Colletti, especially as Stella Nichols, I thought her performance was phenomenal. I thought she went through a believable range of emotions throughout the entire movie. She was the heart of the film, and she was a very vital character to the success of the film. And she handled all of this very well. The film was put on her shoulders, and I thought she was incredibly capable of carrying that weight. I really like this character. I can relate to this character, and I thought it was a character that was, in some ways, you could say kind of cookie cutter, with the kind of, I myself am strange and unusual, this kind of Lydia character. But they did it in a way that didn't feel like it was just the same thing over and over again. And I just thought she did a really good job, and I liked her. And I also liked everyone else. Michael Garza as Ramon, Gabriel Rush as Augie, Austin Zajur as Chuck, even Natalie Ganzhorn did her role well as Ruth. And Austin Abrams played a great bully in Tommy, and the rest of the cast was good too. Uh, and all the other people played the monsters. Kathleen Pollard as Sarah. So for the most part, I thought the cast was quite good. I mean, one of the better casts I've seen for this kind of film, for this kind of audience. I felt that the formula that it copied off of the Goosebumps movie, it added some extra ingredients to it that made it a much more effective mix. And a big part of that is this cast and their performances and the characters themselves. And the screenplay gave them a lot to work with, and that really paid off. And I felt that these characters just had great chemistry. I thought these actors, they worked so well with one another that it just really added to the entertainment factor of the movie. Uh, it's one of those examples of a film where there's not a ton of character development for all the characters, but they have enough personality to make up for it. And the kids just had great chemistry. They had excellent chemistry with one another. It reminded me of the natural chemistry that I had seen in films like The Goonies or The Monster Squad or the first part of the 1990 miniseries It. I felt these kids had more chemistry than the kids in the more recent adaptation of It, if you ask me. Uh, I felt that at some points the chemistry just wasn't really there between all of them. It felt didn't feel natural. But with these kids, I totally bought it. I bought it. I bought that they were friends. I bought that they were companions, and because of that, I was along for the ride with these kids because I bought into their friendship and I bought into the journey as a result. And I honestly would like to see a sequel so I can see more of these kids and to see their next adventures and to see if Stella can actually find a way to bring her friends back. So, yeah, ultimately, I did. I liked the film. I liked the movie. The music by Marco Beltrami and Anna Dobrich, or Drubrich. I mean, I'm sorry. I don't think that's how you say her last name, but it could be. I mean, it's spelled Drubich. So, I mean, I could have said it wrong, but the score is, at times, it's there, but at other times, it's like it's not even there at all. So, yeah, it's one of those scores that ultimately is, for me, it's kind of below average. The editing by Patrick Larsgaard, I wouldn't say there's anything about the editing that's particularly noteworthy, but when it comes to editing, that's not necessarily a bad thing because it depends on what kind of vibe or what kind of film the filmmakers want to go with. And when the editing needs to create some tense sequences, I feel it's very effective at that. So I would say the editing was good. I would say it was a positive. I definitely don't think it was a net negative. But yeah, I don't really know what else to say about Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, except it's one of those movies where ultimately I would say it's just an above average film, despite the things that I did like about it, because ultimately you just get these morsels of these monsters and you want more of them, and you don't really get that. Um, and the whole mystery with Sarah Bellows wasn't really that interesting, and definitely was chock full of cliches. And I know cliches are unavoidable at this point, but it also didn't put really enough of a unique twist on those things to really make it stand out. But at the same time, it did enough to kind of get you. But the only reason why you were really interested in it is because of the characters, not really because of the mystery. You just wanted these characters to find a way to work things out and stop the horror and stop the bleeding, so to speak. But it wasn't really the story itself that was keeping you engaged. It was the characters. So yeah, I ultimately I wish it was an anthology, or I wish that if it was a standalone story, that the overall plot was as strong as the characters were. But for what it is, I liked it. I'd probably pick it up for cheap to add to my collection sometime. I definitely wouldn't mind adding it because ultimately, like I said, I did like the movie, and that's more than I honestly thought. I thought I was gonna dislike this film. I thought I was gonna straight up, honestly, hate this movie, considering all the disappointment I had for this film before I even saw it because it was no longer an anthology. So I honestly am really surprised by how much I ultimately liked the movie, despite the fact that it wasn't an anthology. So I'm glad I gave it a shot, and I would recommend you give it a shot too if you're like me and you're in the same boat. And also if you're just curious about the film and it looked kind of interesting to you, it's definitely worth a watch in that instance. So yeah, I guess if I would rate it at 5 stars, I would give the film 3.5 out of 5 stars. Uh, a fun, above average, young adult chiller with some thrills, with some chills, and goes by at a pretty good pace and has a good cast of characters, some good performances, some nice bits of practical makeup effects, and a good sense of style and visual flair. So anyway, yeah, thank you for watching, and thank you for your cooperation, and have a nice day.